In Norse mythology, the Valkyrie were female angels sent by Odin to the battlefields and to select the Vikings that would be awarded Valhalla. Well, you know, the name Valkyrie is very romantic, I think. You know, it conjures up images of beautiful Norse women, you know, Norwegian girls and Vikings, you know, competing in their arenas and things like that, and conquering new lands and Leif Erikson and all this stuff. And it's a lot of people applaud. A lot of people applaud such you know, images, and I think it's great. Welcome back. I had a gentleman come up to me at the range the other day and asked me what I thought of the 224 Valkyrie. It's the new federal cartridge that was released only about a year ago in 2017. I don't know what month it was actually released to the public, but well, I didn't know that much about the cartridge at first. I knew of the cartridge, and I knew what its basic claims were, but I hadn't really studied the charts and looked at the ballistics and everything. Before I launch off on this, make sure you understand that when I look at a cartridge, I pay little attention to names, because names are basically a promotional device. Companies think long and hard about names. They name cartridges with as much care as a new couple names their new daughter or their new son that's being born. They're very, very careful, because that can sometimes be the blessing or the curse. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. The 224 Valkyrie is a federal cartridge case offering. It uses you'll hear it said that it uses the 6.8 Remington SPC cartridge case, which is true, but the Remington 6.8 SPC cartridge case was actually the old obsolete 30 Remington, which was a rimless counterpart to the 3030 Winchester, the 30 WCF. Back in 1906, Remington basically started up their own advertising campaign, releasing counterpart cartridges for every time Winchester came out with a new cartridge for their lever action rifles. The 30-30, and then they had the 32 Special and so forth. They had a 35 caliber cartridge, and all these. Every time, you know, Remington was in lockstep with them. Within a couple of years, 3 or 4 years afterwards, Remington started putting out their own. So in 1906, they released the 30, among others. They released the 30 Remington, and they released the 35 Remington. Now, the 35 Remington has entirely different rim size and body dimension than the 30 rimless had, but the whole idea, when the 6.8 SPC was conceived, was to have a cartridge case head that wouldn't overly expand the face of the AR-15 bolt face. The AR-15 bolt face was originally designed, remember, for the 223 to 222 size head. There's not a lot of room, there's not an awful lot of metal there to carve away and still retain integrity of the bolt and also the ejection and extraction mechanism. So, that being said, the designer of the 6.8 Remington SPC had to find a cartridge case that really didn't exist. He wanted to have a wider body and a shorter shoulder. That's necessitated by the fact that when you get into a broader, when you get into a wider barrel caliber, when you get into a bigger caliber, if you want to retain a pointed shape with an efficient sectional density and ballistic coefficient, you've got to basically have a long sloping bullet, a long sloping ogive. That long sloping ogive will basically require that the bullet be seated way out farther in the typical case, back where the shank of the bullet is parallel. Well, that presents a special problem with a cartridge that has to be fed into a magazine of standard size. So you have a 223 magazine, which has a particular size of a 2.260, if I'm not mistaken. It has a maximum length. You can't make it a tenth of an inch longer. So in order to fit a long bullet in it, the only way to really handle the situation is to pull the shoulder back where the shank of the bullet is parallel. Well, obviously, pulling the shoulder back means shortening the cartridge. Shortening the cartridge doesn't do much for powder capacity if you stick with the same size cartridge case. So that's what you get into when you're making the 300 blackout. The 300 blackout is a 300. It's a 30 caliber 308 bullet, which has the same situation with a long bullet ogive. And because it's so broad, because it's 30 caliber, it has to be set way back. Well, the first consideration that came up was the 221 fireball case, because it was already short enough to get that particular job accomplished. And I can't help but yawn about the 300 blackout whenever I see the ballistic charts, because I mean it beyond 50 yards. It's nothing at all spectacular. I don't know what in the world it's still doing on the market, but it's a fun plinking round. I'm personally, I can't see any particular need for having a cartridge that you can shoot locks off with or something like that. It's a concept cartridge to some people. I think they have something in their mind about something romantic they would do with the gun. And so it fits into that framework, but it's a very low powered cartridge using a 221 fireball case that doesn't have much powder capacity to get a 30 caliber heavy 30 caliber bullet going. But that's the whole idea behind the 6.8, which eventually now we're talking about the Valkyrie, which is the same case. It's a case which is shorter, but the case itself is broader, but not so broad as to violate the integrity of the bolt face. But you have a cartridge which, in its form factor, works out very well. It's able to generate enough. It's able to generate enough velocity with heavier weight bullets that will basically outclass the 223 Remington to some degree. Not necessarily the 5.56 NATO now. I'm going to qualify that. I've got some figures here that I want to show you. And I also want to introduce a little bit of data that Sierra has on the cartridge that might be a little bit more sobering than some of the advertising literature that you see. The 224 Valkyrie is basically it's a niche cartridge, you might say. It was purpose built. It's conceived to fit a particular audience. The audience is the person who is the competitive shooter, or the long range shooter who desires to use bullets in excess of 77, typically 77 grains in a 224 diameter bullet. Because when you get beyond the 77 grain bullet with the 224 diameter, the ogive now is too long to be supported in that case length of the 223, this 5.56. What happens is that long sloping ogive, in order to stuff it down into the case deeply enough to fit into that magazine length, now you have a naked case mouth that sticks out, protrudes beyond the slope of the bullet, the ogive. So that simply won't work because there are a number of problems with that. First of all, you don't have enough case neck support around the shank of the bullet. And the other thing is you have a naked case neck which is going to hang up in the action. So it's just simply not a viable situation. You can't have that, and it's subject to getting nicked and damaged. So it has to be left out long. And when you do that with a 223 case, then it means that you have to single feed it. You have to, with the bolt open, you have to drop the cartridge into the side and shut the bolt manually, and that works. People who shoot in competitive matches have been doing that for quite a number of years, and they're quite accomplished at it. And there's slow fire situations anyway, so there's no particular great concern. But in recent years, people have become enamored with shooting at extremely long range. And one of the things that people have begun to understand is that when bullets drop below subsonic level, when they drop below, I should say, sonic level, supersonic level, which is at sea level around about 1,150 feet per second, when they descend below 1,150 feet per second, they encounter the following wake of that sound wave that strikes the bullet, just the same as the wake behind a boat through the water when it suddenly cuts, when the pilot cuts the throttle and the wake splashes into the transom and it upsets the boat and it destabilizes it. And essentially the same sort of physics apply with a bullet in flight. When that wake strikes the back of the bullet and collides with the rear end of the bullet destabilizes as well. So it's now I want you to understand that there's a lot of claims that go on with no matter what you're selling, you can make claims, and they can all be true, but you have to ask yourself in all situations, if you're concerned, if you're considering the 224 Valkyrie for its claims, you have to ask yourself immediately, how do the claims apply to me, and do they apply? Is it something that I have to be concerned with, or are they simply factual claims that stand alone apart from me, that have no relevance? And that's oftentimes the case. People can. I see so many of these things on TV, these ads. You can get binoculars. That are being sold on TV. You can get these binoculars that can see for 6 miles. I hope so. When you look through binoculars, if you can't see 80 miles if necessary, 6 miles happens to be the curvature of the Earth, so you can see the end of the curvature of the Earth. That's a valid claim, but you can see 6 miles with your own naked eyes without binoculars. You can see that with anything. So you can see that with anything that you're looking through. So you got to be careful of naked claims that stand alone and have no particular relevance to you. So if a bullet will still be in flight above the speed of sound at 1,300 yards, that's a valid claim. Does that valid claim apply to you? Do you know where you can shoot 1,300 yards, and will you be shooting at 1,300 yards? Do you know how far 1,300 yards is? What can you see at 1,300 yards, and how affected is it by the local climatic conditions? Because when you look at 1,300 yards away, the visual aberration of our own atmosphere can oftentimes displace because of light wave patterns being changed, refraction and all that stuff. Targets don't necessarily appear in the same place where they are. They can appear to be here, but in fact, bending of light waves, they're several feet over to the other side. Anybody who shoots bench rest matches and who looks through 30 power scope on their rifle in a bench rest match understands what these light wave bending issues can do. It can make that target bobble around, and the shooter has to discern where the target really is. Is it over here or is it up here? And it's constantly moving because of mirage. Well, that mirage is greatly exaggerated when you get downrange, and it occurs at virtually all times of the year. Some of the greatest mirage actually occurs, over a heated barrel in the wintertime. And it's very, very common to occur, over heated ground during the middle of the day. It's a common occurrence, and those are things that you have to be concerned about. I can remember when I was in basic training in the Army down at Fort Gordon, Georgia. We went out to the tank range one day, and it's all cluttered with all kinds of old tanks, that've been shot up and things like that. And it was basically a visual exercise that we did. It was to illustrate to us. Basically, it was a challenge to us to see what we could identify out there. And there were, I think, 3 or 4 members of our company that were sent out there before we arrived, and they were placed out there at strategic locations and dressed just like us, with OD green on, and no camouflage or any kind like that. It was just, in those days, everything was just OD green. And they set them out at strategic locations at anywhere between 150 meters all the way out to 500 meters, and everything in between. And there was our whole company was in the bleachers, and on command, these individuals would appear, and we were supposed to identify them. The bullhorn would go out and say, "Man number 1, stand up." And so he would stand up in the open, right out in the open at 150 meters away, and there'd only be a couple of guys who identified where he was in all that scene of rubble out there. Then imagine this could have been trees, or maybe the side of a hillside where elk are and things like that. It's the same sort of situation. We're just looking at scanning and trying to see people who are just standing there. It was very difficult to pick out people, especially as they got farther away. Then the next thing was they had to start moving around, bobbing from side to side, just like this, bobbing, to see if we could identify their face moving. And they didn't have any camouflage on them, and it was still very difficult to identify them. And we could only see certain features, like maybe the glow of their face or something like that, when they were actually moving around. And this was the sort of thing I remember, and we're only talking like 500 meters. When you get out to 1,000 meters, or even 600 meters, that kind of yardage, really makes things disappear, and it makes things to be a challenge. When you're out west, for instance, hunting mule deer and pronghorn antelope, that stuff can disappear out in the middle of the open with no rubble, with nothing out there except just prairie grass. They can be very, very difficult to see. If you go around my neighborhood here, where you might see a woodchuck laying on a stone wall or something like that in the middle of the daytime, you can't tell sometimes if it's a stone or the woodchuck until you might see something that just looks a little bit. It's just not the right shape for a rock. And that you're only talking 150 to 300 yards. This notion of being able to shoot at 1,300 yards, sometimes is a stretch of the imagination for me. And I know it's being done. I know that I know that there's a lot of you out there who are interested in this sort of sport. But let's look at the facts and compare the two cartridges, which are going to be classically compared. The 223 Remington, or 5.56 NATO, and the 224 Valkyrie. That's where that's where we're basically comparing to see how trajectories differ, or how they're improved by the Valkyrie. Well, without question, the Valkyrie succeeds in what it claims, its ability to handle very long bullet weights in excess of 77 grains. So you're talking available bullet weights of 80 grains, 90 grains, and 95 grains. And those 90 and 95 grain bullet offerings have extremely high ballistic coefficient, which can, in fact, extend the range of the trajectory, the ability to keep above the subsonic level. In other words, to maintain that supersonic flight downrange farther. So that is a meritorious achievement that it's able to do that. So, as I said before, ask yourself whether that's applicable to your needs. If it is, then that's a viable situation. Secondly, let's examine whether or not the particular concern can be ameliorated in some other way. For instance, if you've already got a long-throated 223 that you use for service rifle competition, say you've got a rifle that you don't have any issues with, single feeding, and you're not interested in feeding from the magazine, and you want to shoot at those long ranges, you can still shoot 90 and 95 grain bullet weights. But you have to now you have to put a 6.5 inch twist barrel on that rifle. Chances are that's not the twist rate that you have. That means the investment of a different barrel, no different than the investment that applies to whether it's the 223 or this is a ballistic issue that has nothing to do with the head stamp name. This has to do with the need to spin a long bullet at a very fast rate in order to maintain its stability. So whether it's the Valkyrie or whether it's the NATO or the Remington cartridge, same thing applies. It has to be a 6.5 inch twist. A 7 inch is not going to do it. The Sierra specifically says it has to be at least a 6.5 inch twist. So that's an investment that has to be considered apart from all other concerns. What does that do? I want to make sure that you understand what that does, and I spoke about this in my video about twist rates. There's a price to be paid in ballistics, as with so many other things in life. Solving one problem sometimes creates another. You have to sometimes take a more intelligent, broad look at all the issues that you're going to be affecting before you go throwing out the baby with the bathwater. When you have a 6.5 inch twist, just as I've experienced with 7 inch twist, when you're using a longer barrel, and remember, a longer barrel is what maintains those velocities that are advertised. The velocities which are advertised for the Valkyrie at 2,750 feet per second or so with a 90 grain bullet, I'm sure that that's not achieved by a 20 inch barrel. I have Sierra literature right here, which using a 24 inch, with a 24 inch barrel and a 90 grain hollow point boat tail Match King, which is the one which is frequently talked about. Only with one powder, with reload of 17, is it able to achieve 2,700 feet per second, and we don't know whether it's necessarily an accurate load. Very frequently, some of the most accurate loads are not necessarily the highest velocity. That doesn't necessarily go hand in glove. If you're talking about a 20 inch barrel, when you're cutting 4 inches of barrel length off of this 24 inch barrel, you can expect to lose up to 100 to 150 feet per second. Maybe not that much, but you can expect to lose up to 150 feet per second, because you're talking up to 20 to 35, even 40 feet per second per inch of barrel loss when you're taking a barrel down. And it depends. These are unknown factors that depend a lot of times on the particular burning rate of the powder. In other words, slower burning powders that are sometimes the ones that can get those higher velocities are the ones that suffer the greatest. There's this intricate relationship between burning rate in powders and its sensitivity to barrel length. So very often, you've seen, I'm sure that you've seen these articles where people have started out with a particular barrel and they just keep on sawing it off 1 inch at a time, and they they chronograph the loads to see what it does to the velocity. And sometimes it looks like it's not that bad, like it's maybe only 22 feet per second per inch of barrel length. But that's not necessarily applicable to all powders, because some powders, especially slower burning powders, which are able to achieve the highest velocity, require every bit of barrel length in order to get that velocity out. So the particular powder that you need to get that 2,700 feet per second out, that happens to be Reloader 17. That's a fairly slow burning rifle powder. When you get into a more moderate rate burning powder like Reloader 15 or CFE 223, you've lost 100 feet per second with a 24-inch barrel. Losing 100 feet per second with a 24-inch barrel, you can imagine that you could lose as much with a 20-inch barrel. You could lose another 75 to 100 feet per second. And if you've got a 16-inch M4 barrel, now you can be down into the cellar. You can lose another 200 or 300 feet per second, because some of those powders, even the more moderate burning powders, really have to have something greater than 18 or 20 inches in order to get any kind of head of steam up. So those are things that you have to ask yourself. What is it that you like to have for a rifle? If you like to have an M4 style rifle with a 16 or 18 inch barrel, you got to be very careful about the idea of shooting extreme long ranges with velocities which are claimed that are generated from 24-inch barrel length. Barrel length is something that a lot of companies conveniently leave out of the equation when they're advertising their cartridges. That happened with the 264 Winchester Magnum. The 264 Winchester Magnum was advertised with fabulous velocities and very flat trajectories and everything like that. But nobody was told that it was a 26-inch barrel. And when these guys started lugging around 26-inch barrels out in the 8,700 feet up in Wyoming or something, they realized that this is a little bit much. And when they wanted to have their barrels shortened to 22 inches, then they all of a sudden fell off the edge of the earth, and they didn't have the velocity that they bought the rifle for to begin with. So always be sensitive to the fact that you have to have a corresponding barrel length to keep up these velocities. What does this do with? What does this do, for instance, with a 6.5 inch twist barrel when you're dealing with shorter bullets? And as I talked about in my bullet twist, the rifling twist video, quickening the twist will not destabilize a lightweight bullet. I'll repeat that. Quickening the twist will not destabilize a bullet that's shorter, but it could very well fragment the bullet. It could very well rip the bullet apart. Just like a drag racer can sometimes spin his tires so fast that they literally the tires blow off the rims. That can happen very, very easily with a bullet that's overspun. It won't destabilize it, but can evaporate it. It basically can spin so fast that the bullet jacket is just simply shred from centrifugal force. So that's one of the concerns that you can have, and I speak from experience. When you have a 7-inch twist barrel in an M4, in an M4 length, 16 to 18 inches, 16, even an 18-inch length barrel, you can deal with a 7-inch twist and still have, decent bullet performance with 55 grain and sometimes even 50 grain bullets, because the forward velocity is much slower than a 20-inch barrel A2 style or A4 style rifle, like the A4 that I have, when you have a 20-inch barrel, you've got another couple of hundred feet per second. That forward velocity is increasing the RPM. That increased RPM is what really destroys a bullet in flight, and can bulge the bullet so that it's no longer accurate. In other words, it loses it starts to deform the bullet in flight. So I was having that issue with my A4, AR-15A4 with standard bullet weights. 50 and 55 grain bullets simply weren't stabilizing because of the fact that they were deforming in flight, and a couple of bullets literally were not making it to the target because they got so poorly shredded. Now, contacting Sierra and talking to them about it, they instructed me to basically the only recommendation they could give me was to get a 55 grain, the standard 55 grain Spitzer with the boat tail, which they said would probably hold together under those rotational velocities with a 20-inch barrel. But I didn't want to be, I don't like to be pigeonholed with any rifle to a situation where I can't shoot it with the bullets I want to be able to use for certain types of applications. If I want to shoot 50 grain bullets out of my barrel so that I can keep up the velocity, so go woodchuck shooting or something like that, I like to be able to do that. So when I put my new my National Match barrel on it, it has an 8-inch twist, and the 8-inch twist, that difference between 7-inch and 8-inch twist makes all the difference in the world, because basically it enables me to, now I can shoot 50 grain and even 45 grain bullets at standard velocities, which won't really upset the jackets. And it's a perfect, that's National Match barrels classically have 8-inch twist with a 20-inch length tube, because everything is just in that nice velocity range, and the spin rate that the bullets stay together, they stay and they go to sleep. So you can use 69 grain bullets and up to about 77 grain. I can use an 80 grain bullet without any difficulty whatsoever. Now, so you'll say, well, the Valkyrie can use the 90 grain bullet. Well, actually, the 223 can also use the 90 grain bullet if you put a 6.5-inch twist barrel on it. And you can simply, if you really want to shoot the longer bullet weights, you can simply single feed and put a 6.5-inch twist barrel on it. But you say, well, that's not going to give me the same velocities. Well, maybe not. Let me read directly from Western Powder's own chart. Western is the only one that I know of that actually publishes data for the NATO cartridge. And if you've got a an AR-15 rifle that's made for the NATO cartridge, that's made for that cartridge, you can use this data as long as it's rated. If your barrel is rated for a NATO round, you're fine. So what do you get with NATO pressures? Well, if you're using, for instance, accurate 2520 powder, a 90 grain Sierra hollow point boat tail Match King, 2701. What did I just read here? 2,700 feet per second, but with a slow burning powder. With another powder, Ramshot TAC, 2688. That's virtually 2,700 feet per second. So you see, you don't have to necessarily, discount your 223 as a viable chambering, as long as you're willing to single feed it. So while the Valkyrie has that added, that luxury of being able to feed them all into the magazine, if that's something you need to do, that's fine. But remember that when you get up into a very, very fast twist with that 20-inch barrel, if you're using a 20-inch barrel, you're stuck with those long bullets. You're probably going to be fine for shooting bullets down to maybe 69 grains or something like that. But I suspect when you start getting below 69 grains, now you're starting to get into velocities that are pretty significant. You get into 69 grains, you're still dealing with velocities that are, say, 31 to 3,200 feet per second. You get down to 62 and 55 grain bullets. A 55 grain bullet now with a NATO cartridge with a 20-inch barrel, you're up to 3450, 3588 with a 50 grain bullet. That's pretty fast. I can almost certify that bullet's going to shred with a 20-inch barrel at those velocities. So be very cautious about you know, high velocity barrels. That means barrels with a standard, you know, length using extremely fast twists. Make those decisions with very, very good calculation about what you really need to have. You know, 90 grain bullets and 95 grain bullets, they have impressive, they look impressive on paper, but you really have to be able to apply it to yourself. And again, remember, you just don't want to accept every claim on its face without applying it to your situation. Do you want to have these ho-hum velocities of 2,700 and 2,600 feet per second? That's not what I buy a you know, 223 for. I buy a 223 for the exciting velocities that hit down range at 3,000 feet per second, you know, a couple of 100 yards down there. That's what I like with a 50 grain bullet. I don't like to sacrifice that. And you know, you'd be surprised how far out you can get with a 50 grain and 55 grain bullet that's zapping out at full velocities at 31, 3,200, 3,300 feet per second with a 20-inch barrel. But when you start chopping it back to that 14 and 16-inch barrel length, 18-inch barrel length and everything, you're really sacrificing a lot. So that's all there is to it. And you know, if you're romanticized about the fact that you know, it's got that really fancy name. I like Valkyrie. I think that's a classic name. I've been to Norway. I've seen the Norse people, and they're fabulous. I have friends over there, and you know, it's a very romantic cartridge name. I think they took a page. Federal took a page from Hornady's book by, you know, with the 6.5 Creedmoor. I think that was much more interesting a name than the 260 Remington, which is almost identical. The 260 Remington actually has better ballistics, but the 6.5 Creedmoor just sounds more American. It sounds more exciting, much more romantic than 260 Remington, which sounds a little bit like a half-baked 270 Winchester. So, you know, it's a lot of times it's in the name. So maybe the 224 Valkyrie will, you know, succeed on the merits of its good name, and perhaps it has a future. But I don't want to see. Please, if you're inclined towards writing about it, how it's going to replace the 223 Remington tomorrow, or the 5.56 NATO for the military, and it's going to be the next best thing for, you know, for serving the armed forces, please don't go there, because that's been tried, that's been attempted, and that door isn't coming down. So anyway, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and tell your friends about us, and God bless.